Dan, again, feel free to interrupt throughout or ask questions. That's what I would expect. I'm presenting stuff with two of my co-authors, Sarah Anderson and Laurel Harbridge, who are both great scholars in their own right. And if you have a chance ever to get to meet them, I encourage you to do so. They're just incredible scholars. What I'm presenting today is a book, essentially. It's a forthcoming at Cambridge. It'll come out probably early next year. Now, the tricky part about presenting a whole book is it's too much to do. So don't worry, we're not going to do it all. But I hope to give you a sense of the main findings from what we have in the book. Our motivation for starting this project dealt with gridlock. By that, I just mean when policy isn't passed. So legislative gridlock, when the legislature doesn't pass different policies for whatever reason. We started looking at this nearly 6 years ago. And when we started, our motivation was trying to understand why we might get more gridlock or less, the legislature doing less, passing less. There are several explanations. So here's just 3 listed on the slides. First, polarization might lead to a lack of common ground. So I work in the US. In the US context, we have the 2 major parties. Those 2 major parties may just not agree on anything. And if they don't agree, then why should they pass something, right? So this lack of common ground would be one reason we'd see gridlock. And so that's, of course, driven by increase in polarization, et cetera, et cetera. A second is there might be common ground, but legislative leaders, so party leaders or committee chairs, might prevent those things from being voted on. So there could be no common ground, or there could be common ground that doesn't get voted on. So that's agenda control. That's another reason we might see gridlock. A third, which is what's highlighted, is this possibility that there is common ground, they agree, they vote on it, but some people reject it. So there's common ground, but someone would reject a policy that that's common ground for them or is a benefit for them. So this is a stylized, very simple, single dimension policy space. We're talking about a case where there's a status quo, there's someone who has a preference, there's a proposal that moves the status quo towards them. Throughout our manuscript, we often call this a half-loaf compromise. Legislators in the US often invoke this imagery of half a loaf, that you're getting part of what you want, but not everything. And so part of this was, does this happen? Is it a case that there's proposals like this where that legislator votes no? Now that would be puzzling because, at least on a single dimension space, that policy should make them better off. So we should expect them to vote yes. So part of what we wanted to do is just see, in fact, no, that doesn't work, that's fine. Do we ever see legislatures doing this? There are a couple of reasons we looked at this. First, it's not that we don't think these other 2 are important. They are. In fact, we think that they're incredibly important, maybe even a bigger driver. But we wanted to start with this third point because we haven't studied it much as a discipline, so we wanted to see, does this occur? Second, we wanted to see whether, let me step back. We found this type of rejection potentially normatively troubling. By that, what do I mean? Take the lack of common ground. If the Republicans and Democrats disagree, it's not clear why we should expect them to vote on something, right? If they disagree, there is a perfectly reasonable reason why we would say, well, then you shouldn't move it forward if there's no common ground. Whereas if there is common ground and they're rejecting that came across to us as a more normatively troubling kind of situation. So that's our motivation for why we started this project. The book follows this kind of general overview. The first part studies whether legislators reject this half-loaf compromises. And what we find is that they do it because of voter punishment. Okay? The second part of the book then goes into trying to find out what do legislators mean by this voter punishment? Who are they fearing? And what comes out of that is they're concerned about a subset of primary voters in the U.S. So in the U.S., you have, of course, the primary elections, determines who runs in the general, and that first stage is where this fear of punishment is located in. They are fearing a subset of primary voters. So data comes there from survey from legislators, how they vote on roll calls in the legislature, and then we have some survey voters. The last part of the book kind of says, here are some solutions to this. Do they seem to work? And what comes out of that is that one of the solutions that we test, and there is some evidence for, is that allowing more negotiation to occur in private would increase or decrease the likelihood that legislators reject these compromise, these common ground solutions.
May I ask you a question?
Please.
Why primary voters are not shared our vote?
Great question. So the answer is that's what legislators say. So this is not a theoretical point. This is just what they, in fact, tell us. So this is going to be important because I've highlighted the first and the third point because that's what I'm going to talk about today. So this part that I have the slides for, and when we get there, please ask me again and I can show you which parts of that evidence you'd like to see. But the answer is this is what legislators are telling us. So again, what I'm going to do today is focus on, I'm going to focus on this first point and the second point, but I'm happy to talk about first and third. I'm happy to talk about the second point, though, as much as we like. I'd like to start with the first point, at least, answer any questions, and as we go, feel free to ask questions and talk about things you guys want to hear about. So, to start off, one of the things that we did is we did a pre-analysis plan, and for those, I'm sure you guys are familiar with these. This is where before you do the study, you go through and say exactly how you're going to test it. You say, here's the data. So before we collect the data, here's how we're going to collect the data. Here's our hypotheses. Here's how we're going to run here's how we're going to run the regression. Here's the variables that's going to be in the regression. So we did one of these pre-analysis plans, and here were the four punishments that the four hypotheses that we laid out in our pre-analysis plan. Okay, so in this document, we said, hey, there's going to be four things we're going to test for. The first hypothesis is that they might reject these kind of offers because they fear voter punishment. So they may think that, among ourselves, we called this the Tea Party hypothesis. In the US at the time, the Tea Party was gaining some traction. The leader of the House Republicans had just lost in a primary. And that was kind of, people wondered about, is this evidence of him being punished for compromising? So this was the first claim, or the first thing that we want to test. They might reject this because they fear they're going to be punished by voters. The second was a moral framing. So there's arguments out there that issues that that are moral issues are ones that we are more likely to hold our position strong on. So we don't want to compromise at all. We don't want to, if we don't get it, we want all or nothing. Now, we're not going to test whether moral issues, but whether you frame it as a moral issue. And let me be distinct, very clear about that. The third was denying the opposition party credit. So in the US, there was a big debate about health care, often called Obamacare. Before it was Obamacare, a lot of the key elements were actually endorsed by Mitt Romney, who's a Republican. But once it became Obamacare, it seemed that those were no longer popular among Republicans. So, and part of the argument here might be they wanted to deny, they didn't want to pass a policy because then that would be giving credit for Obama because when he became the torchbearer. So that's the hypothesis we wanted to test. The final was this idea of future power. So there's arguments that what matters is if I pass a moderate policy today, that becomes the new status quo. And actually, a moderate status quo is actually harder to change than a more extreme status quo. So if in the future I think I'm going to be better off, I actually might be better off waiting and then moving it even further if I'm going to have more power in the future. So these were our four hypotheses. We're going to test them, but I don't want you to have to remember them. So we're going to put that up there. Okay? So here's our 4 hypotheses that we're going to go ahead and test. Now, part of how we tested them was doing a survey of state legislators in the US. So what we did is we asked them about how to vote on how they would vote, on a gas tax proposal. At the time, this was a point where the federal government in the US was giving less money to states for road repair. And as a result, a lot of states were considering whether to raise money on the gas or diesel as a way of funding roads, funding infrastructure, right? And so this was a proposal that was being considered. For us, it was a nice proposal to consider for a couple of reasons. If I don't remember that earlier slide, we needed to measure both where the status quo was, where the legislator's preference was, and how they would vote on a proposal in the middle. So the nice thing about the gas tax is it's really easy to measure the status quo. We know what it is. It's a number, it's given. We then we asked the the legislators what they wanted on the gas tax. So that provided us their ideal point and then the status quo. And then we provided a vignette in a survey experiment where we said, okay, what about a proposal in the middle? And we see how they voted. Something with abortion is harder to put on a scale, but with the gas tax, it's on a scale, it's very easy to, we all know what increasing it by 5 cents means, or 5, it's very clear. Our sample, we got a 5% response rate. So we have 257 respondents who are legislators. I should say these are self-identified legislators. So in the survey, we asked them, are you a staff or a legislator? And we're dropping the staff. And we're using the people who self-identified as a legislator. We have 257. That's a low response rate. I like to think of it as 2.5 US Senates. Is how I like to think of it. But because it's low response rate, one concern that reviewers could reasonably have was about the representativeness. It's very representative. What is true of all surveys is more Democrats respond than Republicans. In the US, the parties on the left respond more than parties on the right. That may or may not be true here. I think that's generally true pretty much everywhere. It's still pretty representative. So 54% of the sample were Democrats, and at the time, 48% of the legislatures overall. So actually, even there, it's pretty representative. We did something called inverse probability weights. So that's IPW. This is just you weight your sample to make it representative of this sample as a whole, or the population as a whole. You get the same results. So that's the basics of the survey. Here is our vignette. The things that are in brackets are things that varied across individuals. The things that are in bold varied experimentally. So to give you a distinction, we didn't vary what state you were in. Whatever state you're in, okay? But that depended on what the legislator. So we told them what the status quo of the gas tax was. We remind them of what they had told us their preference was. We then, in terms of the 4 hypotheses, two of these we tested by experimental manipulations, and 2 we tested by correlating with a survey response. So if you know that first line, we're varying who proposed it. Is this a bill coming from your party, the other party, or a bipartisan bill? So we varied what party was responsible. So that was to try to test denying credit, hypothesis 3. So if it's coming from the other party, are you voting against it? Down here, we did the moral arguments. So here are some arguments from the sponsor about why you should vote for this. And we varied if that was framed in moral terms or not. Then we looked at, would you vote for this bill, yes or no? Any questions at this point? Okay. You're welcome to interrupt at any time you want. This was the test. This is how we tested the other 2 hypotheses. We asked them about, for this issue, do you expect to have more power in the future? Do you expect to be people with your preference to have more power or less power in the future? So that was trying to test this future power. The people who thought they would be in a better position in the future, would they be more likely to vote no? Finally, we asked how much retribution they would face from voting for compromising. So in general, if you were to make compromises on policy, how much retribution would you face from voters in your district? So hypothesis one. So what we find, this is just the coefficients from the regression. Overall, about a quarter of legislators said they would vote no on this proposal. And I should have been clear, the proposal was always the midpoint. It was always between the midpoint between the status quo and what they said their preference was. So a quarter said they would reject it, 1 in 4. What predicted who that was people, so if we look through this, the voter retribution question did predict it, okay? So those who thought that they would face more retribution were more likely to vote no. The moral frame, at least our description, didn't do it. Denying credit, so we see here who sponsored it. It's an insignificant predictor. And then future power also was not. We also included these control variables, but we had no prior prediction about why those control variables would do it. But among our 4 hypotheses, the only one that we found support for was the voter punishment. So one question that we had after this, we had less power than we expected. That is, there were fewer respondents than we expected when we started that survey. So we went through and did a survey of city officials in the US. It wasn't about the gas tax, but it was about city spending. Similar setup. What we find, we have a larger sample. And then one of the things we find is we again went through, didn't find any evidence for this, but a second time we found the voter punishment correlated with this, okay? So thinking that you expect to be punished by voters for compromise makes you more likely to reject it. Part of what we then went on to do, and this is the part that I'm going to skip for now, although I'm happy to talk about it more later. We did a series of in-person surveys. We looked at their roll call behavior. So we looked at members of Congress and how they voted during the Republican administration and whether the size of the Tea Party predicted your likelihood of rejecting. So the idea here is the Tea Party was a group in the US that was centered around a key part of it was rejecting compromise, rejecting proposals from the other party. And so the larger that subset of voters were, the larger the potential to be punished was. And did we see that a larger set of Tea Party voters led to more rejection? And the answer is yes. And I'm happy to talk about that. And then we did some surveys of voters as well. Okay, so this is the first part of my talk, and I'm happy to talk through anything more. But the big summary here is politicians reject these half-loaf offers, these compromise offers, and they do so because they fear punishment from a subset of primary voters. Now, that subset of primary voters was not part of this study. Remember, we just asked them about voters. That comes out of this part that I'm kind of skipping over. Okay.
So far, so good.
So far, so good, you said?
Yes.
Okay. Happy to answer any more questions about this. So in terms of the second part, or the last part of my presentation today, we went through and said, okay, can we do anything to increase compromise? So if punishment is an issue, is there anything we can do to increase the level of compromise? We decided to focus on the negotiation process. So we tested 2 kind of claims out there that might affect this. The first was from a group called No Labels. This is a group that operates in the US that tries to be a bipartisan group. About 1 in 10 members of Congress is part of their kind of group. They have a caucus in Congress called the Problem Solvers Caucus. They initially it was Joe Manchin and John Huntsman. So these were kind of Joe Manchin's a Democrat, John Huntsman's a Republican. They kind of created this manifesto, okay? And their manifesto was, what we need to start with is we need to start by getting politicians to agree on the end goal. So if we can agree on the end goal, then we'll make compromises on the means to get there. And so they identified 4 major areas, and they said, listen, if we can agree on the end goal, then we'll make compromises. So among those 4 areas, one of them, for instance, is making the US energy secure. So the idea here is maybe the Democrats want to achieve that goal through investing in green energy. The Republicans want to do that by expanding oil and gas exploration in the US. But they both have an end goal that they like, which is less dependent on oil from other countries. And so the idea is if we can agree on the end goal, maybe we can make a compromise that would allow us to achieve that. Okay? And so they identified kind of 4 areas, balancing the budget, making Social Security solvent, essentially, energy secure, and I'm forgetting the 4th right now.
No foreign policy issue?
No foreign policy issue in that. Well, to the extent that the energy secure is, in some sense, about not relying on the Middle East for oil. That's kind of the motivation for it. But yeah, nothing else that was explicitly foreign policy. So their claim then is that, hey, if we can just get you to agree on the end goal, then of course you'll make compromises on the means. So let me go back one slide. The second was about dealing with negotiating in either private or public. Okay? Now, to test both of these, we went to something called the National Conference of State Legislators. This is a conference for politicians. So we go to academic conferences. I go to the American Political Science Association conference, and you go there, and everyone from all the world comes. So this is a very similar kind of thing. There are talks throughout the day. There's a large exhibit hall. The exhibit hall is a pretty interesting experience. So it's much larger than the exhibit halls in the conferences I go to. And these are groups that give out they're groups that either want legislators to buy something or they want policy from legislators. So these are a lot of lobbying groups. We went, and I've been enough years, I've been 3 years now. And one of the things is there's a draft to pick where you locate it on the floor. And the way the draft works is the more money you donate to the NCSL, to the organization, you get a pick in a higher order. So people who donate more money are more centrally located. And so you have things like, in the US, it's the NRA is very close up front. So nice. Yes. NRA, and then a lot of things that deal with medical. So a lot of healthcare, doctors. That's kind of who gets this spot. Which worked out perfect, actually. Because what we did is we would sit in our booth and we'd ask them to sit down and take a survey with us, right? And so the good thing is by the time they got to us, they were done. And so they weren't worrying about getting on to the next thing. The other thing about this experience is they all wanted something free. It's a very surreal experience. They have a bag they get, and they go around and they take free things from each. It's kind of like...
What do they take from the NRA? The rifle?
The NRA give out some of the...
AK-47?
They do give out flashlights that are in the shape of bullets. They give out shirts. They give out a backpack, the NRA did. They gave out the most. They had the most goodies that they gave out.
Okay. Why am I not surprised?
But it's kind of like Halloween in the US where they go around from booth to booth asking for
candy.
Asking for candy, yes. But they don't want to talk to you. So they wait till you're not looking and then they sneak up and grab your thing and then move on to the next one. So it's a very unique experience. Anyways.
Anything of that sort, Luca? Do we have anything of that sort?
Well, again, you might have it with something like, as you were talking, like the parties would have a convention or something like that. Yeah, that's probably the closest. So about 1,000, I want to say about 800 legislators attend. We got about a fourth of them to sit down and do our survey. So 1 out of the 4 who were at the conference. And we would just sit there and shake their hands and get them to sit down. So in 2016 when we went, we asked them we tried to take them through a vignette again. Again, remember, this is the shared goals, right? So that if we agree on the end goal, then we'll be more likely to get there. So what we did is we tried to get them, if you got into the experiment part of this, not the control group, but the experimental group, you had a pen and paper and you had to write down kind of why this was a top priority for you. So we'd ask them, okay, of these 4 issues, we used the 4 issues from the no labels, which one do you care about? And they'd identify one. We'd say, okay, well, why is this an important priority for you? Legislator Smith, who is the one that they were negotiating with, would provide a reason why that was a goal for him. They would then, they'd ask which of these tools they preferred to address this issue. So would you prefer to do more investment in green energy or more gas and oil exploration? So the control group kind of skips this, doesn't have this. They then go into the vignette, which is ask, okay, in the vignette they say, so Legislator Smith, he's the other party, right? So this was for a Democrat here. He would also prefer to secure this, but he'd do it by decreasing benefits. So in this case, that meant that the person taking the vignette wanted to do it through increasing taxes. They say, would you support and vote for a proposal where 50% came from your means and 50% came from Legislator Smith, right? So the idea is, what if we did it by doing half and half? Would you vote for that? We can talk about why this is maybe not the exact treatment no labels would want, which is totally reasonable, but at least our version of no labels attempt had no effect. That is, we were unable to move them on this. So they both said about 50% of the time, yeah, I'd vote for it, and 50% of the time, I wouldn't. And it didn't depend on whether you went through this exercise of trying to agree on the end goal. To us, it's not completely surprising. Remember, from this part that I've skipped over, legislators are worried about being punished by primary voters. But those primary voters don't just care about the end goal, they very much care about the means. And so the idea that compromising on the means is where the action is at. And so compromising on that is what's important. So the end goals is, so we don't find any evidence of this being true. So now that we start with a null result, let me say that we're not going to find a null result in the second one. Forecast that. We went back a year later. Well, sorry, I guess I just said this out loud, but let me just reiterate this. It may not be surprising that focusing on shared goals doesn't solve it, in part because when you think about primary voters, so we did a survey of primary voters, and most of them don't believe that what you get matters. Like, the ends justifies the means. They really care about the compromise on the means. So it's not surprising that then this doesn't move. If in fact they are worried about voter punishment, this is not going to alleviate that concern. So in 2017, these are my co-authors, by the way. That's Sarah and Laurel. So we went again and recruited legislators to sit down and take our survey and participate in our study. And this one, we want to make it about negotiating in public versus private. The way it worked out is they picked an area of the budget that should change. So in their state, they all represented a state level government, and we asked them about the common areas of the budget in the state legislature. And we said, what should be increased, what should be decreased? And then we assign them to an issue. They then get this negotiation vignette. So again, this is another vignette. All these were vignettes. And they're assigned either to negotiate in public or private. So let me walk you through some of the key parts here. As the details of the bill dealing with the spending are being finalized, the key Republican legislation on the other side. Okay, so this is going to a Democratic legislator, right? This is a Democrat. You're always seeing the other party. The Republicans want to keep the budget the same from last year's level of spending. And they ask to discuss, and here's the treatment, during a public meeting. or as a private meeting in order to work out the to work out a compromise. We then make sure that we emphasized at the end that the local paper was expected to attend and report on the meeting, and the press is interested in reporting on the details, including the back and forth of the proposals and counter proposals. Part of what we wanted to do is we wanted to emphasize, the reason we included this in is we didn't want the public or private to be about the level of interest. So we wanted to hold that constant across Vignette. Right now, all we're doing is we have this word public meeting or private meeting. And that could potentially bundle lots of things. So if I say it's a public meeting, to me, then you might think about the press. And so we wanted to hold the level of press constant. There are other things that could be potentially bundled with it that we didn't control for, but we did want to at least hold that constant in the Vignette because it was something that we were worried about. Here's the results. We asked them about 2 outcomes. The first was we asked them, would you be willing to meet? And the answer is it makes them less likely to meet in private. So if you want to meet in private, they say they're less likely to do that. They also say, though, that if they meet in private, they're more likely to get the outcome, a compromise outcome, right? So this is kind of a...
Weird.
No, I don't think this is weird at all. I think this is actually normal. But this is where it's like, even this is not a perfect solution, right? So the idea is, yes, conditional on being able to meet in private, they think they are going to be more willing to get a compromise. We think that is because they're worried about this punishment from primary voters. But we also think that's why they're less likely to want to meet in private in the first place. Because voters also don't really like allowing them to have this negotiation in private, right?
So they would like to do so, but they're afraid of being punished if they do.
I think that's how we interpret, that's at least how we interpret this. Yeah. We think this is still about voter punishment, right? Like, voters aren't going to reward us for meeting in private, but we are more likely to get the outcome if we do meet in private. Okay, so sharing goals so emphasizing these shared goals doesn't increase the willingness to compromise on the means. Conducting negotiations in private rather than public does increase their willingness to compromise, with the caveat that they are less likely to actually take that meeting. So that's something that there's not a perfect solution there either. But something that this is motivating us. This is my last slide, so you can start thinking about what questions you want to ask. What motivated this was, this normative question for us at least, was, does this occur? This seems normatively bad. It's not really a normative question. Does this occur? The answer was, at least in a survey, we found some evidence that they seem to be willing to reject compromises that make them better off. So that's unusual, and that is troubling to us as researchers at least, because we think that's going to exacerbate gridlock in ways that we think aren't great. We tried to focus on some solutions. There's some potential for private negotiations. In terms of our future, we're going to do a couple field experiments. Part of what we're thinking about doing as this first one is actually, it's fitting that I'm on tape today, part of what we're thinking about doing is actually going to meetings and varying whether we have a camera in the back to record them and see if this changes how they debate, basically. So tell them in advance that we're going to come record. Sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. And we see if when the camera is present and they know it's present, do they deliberate differently. That's one thing that we're thinking about doing. Something else we're working on, when we talk to them, we also had like an open-ended response part of the survey. And the thing that they all say, whether they believe it or not, is this is about communicating Fenno-esque style. This is about communicating to your constituents. That's how we got to solve this. I'm not sure that's true, but it's at least worth asking. One thing, and this is my own research, I've done a lot on how do legislators communicating to voters, how does that change voters' opinions? But I think that's sometimes the wrong question to ask, and I'm saying this of my own research, because I don't really care whether I change your opinion. What I care about is, will you still vote for me? So Fenno uses the words leeway. That's a word we use. And so maybe I don't have to change your opinion. I just have to get you to give me leeway. And I think this is something that we're interested in pursuing more of, which is, can I communicate with you in a way that gets leeway? So it's not that I'm trying to change your opinion, I'm just trying to get you to allow me the freedom to not punish me, so I can vote this way and not lose office. A third thing that we're doing, which doesn't follow from this other than it's the same general goal, is we're in the process of applying for grant money right now to run an experiment where we're going to basically have them have meals together. So the idea is you're going to be assigned to work with someone across the aisle, and you're going to have a meal several meals together over like a 4-month period. So the idea is breaking bread together, do we see them co-sponsoring more bills in the legislature? So we're going to do this with some state legislators, hopefully in the next year or two.